Luke chapter 10, and verse 25 through 37. So I'd like to make this story practical even for the children this morning. And I'm going to ask for a volunteer from one of the little boys to start thinking about that. You don't have to do anything too crazy, so just all right, so in Luke chapter 10, it says, "Behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" All right, what's a lawyer? Anybody? What comes to your mind? People you want to stay away from, right? An attorney, all right. What does a lawyer do?
Knows the law.
Right. Now, in this case, this is probably slightly different than today. Today, a lawyer, you have all kinds of lawyers, right? Lawyers that study different sections of the law. A lawyer is someone who's kind of like the authority, right? Like he knows everything there is about a certain subject. At least he thinks he does. Sometimes they don't always know. They got to go back into books and learn. But here, this lawyer, I think, was perhaps like an Old Testament study lawyer. Am I correct? I kind of think that. Like he's a man that knows the law of God, the Old Testament, and how to live it. Maybe a Pharisee, I don't know. But the lawyer is probably tempted to feel like he's the authority and he knows more than the other people that aren't lawyers. You're not a lawyer and I am. Kind of the same thing that happens with like theologians, right? They're the ones that know the Bible. Everybody else is just a step below that. You can take that in almost any field, but I think when it says that this lawyer came to tempt Jesus, that's kind of how he felt. He knows the law, he knows the truth, and he's coming to show some deficiency in Jesus. Interestingly, Jesus kind of turns this around on him and shows him that he is actually the deficient one that doesn't understand the law. Look what Jesus did. Jesus said, he said unto him, okay, so he asked the question, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus turns his back on his head. He said unto him, what is written in the law? Right? You're the lawyer, right? Like, don't you know the answer to this? Like, maybe you're the deficient one. Like, you say you know the law. Like, why don't you understand this question? What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. Do this, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? I'm kind of glad he asked this question. He could have just walked away. But Jesus here, if he wouldn't have asked this question, we wouldn't have the next story. What's the next story? Jesus didn't say, okay, I'm going to give you 10 points about who your neighbor is. Rather, he just told a story that illustrated this. And what I find so fascinating about Christ's stories is like I don't know, did Christ spend time thinking about these stories before? Like, was he laying in bed thinking about this question and he came up with all these details? Because there's all these details in this story are significant. The priest, the Levite, the Samaritan, they're all significant. Like, how in the world did he just come up with this story to answer this question? Perhaps he thought about these things as he lay in bed, as he prayed. I don't know. Maybe the Spirit just gave him these answers. I don't know. But I'm glad that the lawyer asked this question because I think Jesus would have just let him go. Like, he would have just went, and we wouldn't have this story. But we have this story just packed with meaning, and we want to read that here in verse 29 or 30. So Jesus is going to answer the question, who's the neighbor? And that's the title that I'd like to have this morning. Who is my neighbor? Right, you all know who your neighbors are. It's the person that lives beside you next door. But Jesus is saying, no, this is not. Right? Neighbor means something different. Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. So this man, we don't know who the man is, possibly a Jewish person, right? He lived in Jerusalem, or we think he does. Maybe he's a Jewish person. He's gone down to Jericho. And so he's out walking along this road between the two cities where it's probably common for thieves to hide behind the bushes and come out and just take everything you got. We don't know a lot what that's like here, but there's countries where that's still a very real thing. They don't go certain roads certain times of the day or night because there's people out there just waiting for that lone person to come along. And by chance there came a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. All right, what do we know about a priest? What are priests? Anybody know?
Work in the temple.
They work in the temple. They're doing the service of God, right? Important stuff, right? They're like the religious, important people. So he comes along, and I don't know what all went through his mind, but he just passes on. And likewise, a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. What do we know about Levites? Yeah. They also worked in the temple, right? They had the whole tribe of Levi was kind of dedicated to that, to being priests. But a certain Samaritan, and what do we know about Samaritans?
Low class.
Okay, lower class. They were kind of off by themselves, away from the Jewish people. The Jewish people looked down their noses on them. Anything else that comes to your mind about Samaritans? Is it right that the Jews and Samaritans didn't really get along? I don't think they did. They wouldn't go through, the Jewish people wouldn't go through the Samaritans' village or something like that. So I think it's significant. He says a Samaritan came along. So the Jewish man's laying on the ground, the Samaritan comes along, and as he journeyed, he came where he was, and when he saw him, he had what? Compassion. He had compassion on him. The Samaritan, the man that you kind of looked down on, the one didn't fit in with all the Jewish tribes. He wasn't the priest. He didn't work in the temple. He wasn't a Levite, like dedicated to the work of God. He didn't have a title. He was just a common man, right? And he's going on his way, and he sees a need, and he had compassion, and he did something. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and setting on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow he departed. When he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more when I come again, I will repay thee. So that's the story Jesus told. Now he turns the question back to the lawyer. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? And he said, He that showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said unto him, Go and do thou likewise. Do we have a volunteer, one of the young boys? Brave? No? What about one of you? Okay, so you're gonna be the man going from Jerusalem to Jericho, right? So you're coming walking, start over there, and you come walking along, you're gonna head over there. Right? So just start walking, come along the front here. And from out from behind the bushes, somebody's gonna come and get you. And he's gonna take everything you got. Now, we're just gonna lay you down here. I said you're not gonna do anything too crazy. And I said, you're just laying there, like you're half dead. And you just lay there. And the priest is coming along, and he sees this person, but like he's this religious man, right? He doesn't want to touch this half-dead man, and he's got temple work to do, so he's just going to go by, let the man lay there. And then the Levite, the same way, right? The Levites who said he's dedicated to the work of the Lord. But the work of the Lord's over there. That's not the work of the Lord. So he's just going to leave that. But then the Samaritan comes. And I want you to look in your Bibles and tell me some things here that this Samaritan does. So he comes, what's the first thing he does?
Went to him.
He went to him. He didn't back away, like he went right up to him. Hey, what's wrong? Are you okay? But there's a problem here. Something needs to be fixed. And then what did he do? Right, so there's, he had probably been stoned, maybe clubs thrown at him, who knows what. Where did he get the stuff to bind up the wounds? maybe he took off his shirt, maybe he got out his handkerchief, and he wrapped them up. And then what did he do? Well, where did he get the oil? I wondered about that too. Maybe this is imported oil. Maybe that was his salad dressing for his lunch or something. I don't know. But the point is, he used the things that he had. Like, he just used his everyday things for the need that was at hand. And then, what did he do next? Set him on his donkey. Now, how hard do you think that is? Did you ever try to pick up an adult that's completely limp? I have. I tried. My dad isn't that big and heavy. Maybe he's heavier than I think. But when he had some episodes earlier where he was completely limp, I could hardly pick him up. And he not only picked him up, but he put him up on his donkey. Okay, so I know you're not too heavy, but I think I can pick you up. But it's a struggle, right? And I gotta put you up on the donkey. And then I take you to the inn. All right, you can sit down. I said it didn't be too crazy, so I hope that wasn't too bad. I just want to illustrate that it wasn't an easy thing that he did. And I also want to illustrate that he just used the common, simple things that he had on hand. Right? So sometimes we think we overthink problems, I think. We think we need education. We need to know how to deal with certain problems before we can help. And I'm not minimizing that we don't. There are things sometimes that we need to learn how to help, but he helped in ways that he could. But I also noticed another thing. He didn't take him to his own house to try to fix the problem. He actually realized that this problem is bigger than what I can handle myself. And he took him to the inn, right? He took him to the inn and he paid money for somebody else to take over the care of this man. So, like we might not be able to fix the problems of the world, but there's little things we can do, and we have to also realize that there's things we can't do. Like, there's places where we need outside help. We need help beyond what we can give to somebody. So it's easy to think maybe about all the people out there that you might meet that you can serve in some way or another, but Galatians 5 brings us even closer home. He says that we're to, by love, serve one another, for the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. He's actually bringing this very phrase right into our own community, our own brothers and sisters. And then he says, like, the opposite of that is if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. So on one side we have bearing one another's burdens, and on the other side we have biting and devouring one another. And if you look at our family, like Derlin's face is kind of bruised up right now, and my wife cut her finger. It might look like we were in a fight or something. And I told Derlin that instead of everybody asking him what happened, he could just stand up and tell us all, but he didn't agree to that. So I volunteered to do it for him. He didn't like that either. So anyway, you can all ask him what happened. But see, when we bite and devour one another, that's what happens. Like, I think what happens sometimes in, I think I've seen this, where there's a common enemy, where there's a common foe, like we kind of band together against that. But when we lose our focus on what the enemy is, we kind of become each other's enemies, and then we start to bite and devour. And I think that's what can happen, is we lose sight of the fact that we are not each other's enemies. We're to bear each other's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And then in Galatians 6, he says, don't be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. And then he says, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men. Be like the Samaritan, do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. And so he just brings that right back again to make it personal to right wherever we are today. Be that good Samaritan to your brother and sister in the Lord. I was listening to a sermon that David Anderson gave, and he gave this illustration about that we all kind of live in a bubble. Like, we live in this think what he meant by that is we have kind of a comfort zone we live in. The priest had kind of his bubble he lived in. Like he knew what he was supposed to do. He knew his temple work, he knew the priestly work, and he knew it was his bubble. It was his comfort zone. The Levite the same way. The Samaritan didn't have, well, maybe he had a bubble too. We probably all have that. We all have some kind of comfort zone. But the point is that to make this practical in real life, we have to sometimes get out of our comfort zone. We have to sometimes get out of our bubble and try to identify the feelings of others in order to have compassion and mercy on them. So as I was saying there in Galatians, it's easy to look at each other as our enemy, but Christ is saying we must look at each other as our neighbor. And it's when we understand that our enemy is not another person. Our enemy is the devil. Our enemy is the prince of the power of the world that is trying to deceive us and trip us. That's the enemy. The robbed man on the ground wasn't the enemy. The Samaritan is not the enemy. They're neighbors, Jesus said. And they're to have compassion upon each other. So who's the robbed man and who's the neighbor? We should say who is our neighbor? In Luke chapter 10, what we read there, Jesus said, "Now which of these three thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves?" And the lawyer's answer was, "He that showed mercy on him." Now I want you to look in your Bibles there again. Jesus basically gave a 2-point outline for what to do when you're in that situation. He gave 2 of the smallest words, almost the smallest words, maybe not in the language back then, but in the English language. 2 action words, very, very small. What are we supposed to do? In verse 37, Jesus said unto him, "Go and do." 2 two-letter words, just go and do. And I could stand here and try to give you a whole list of places and scenarios and everything where you might be able to show mercy to someone. But Jesus just said, go and do. It kind of reminds me of what he said to the disciples. I don't forget if this was the 70 or the 12 or who it was. But he says, when you go into the cities, he said, as you go, preach. So 2 words, go, preach. As you go, and I think we could say the same thing here, as you go, do thou likewise. So we don't have to know exactly what situation you're going to run into tomorrow or next week. As you go where? As you go to work, as you go to the gas station, as you go to the store, as you go help your neighbor, as you go wherever, just go and do thou likewise. Those are the 2 commands. And just a story here that I want to read yet to illustrate this. I think a story is much better than giving you 10 points. It's a story that you all probably know, the story that Leo Tolstoy wrote, Where Love Is, God Is. How many know that story? I probably read it here a couple times, but if you're like me, some of these stories are kind of timeless, and we hear them again and again, and they always have some meaning. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read this story and think about how this person was like that Samaritan. He just, as he was going, he had compassion, go and do. And it's a little bit of a lengthy story, but I won't have too many more comments after this. In a certain town there was a cobbler, Martin, I don't know how to say his last name, Martin. He had a tiny room in the basement, the one window of which looked out on the street. Through it, one could only see the feet of those who passed by. So he's there working on shoes, and he's down in the cellar, right? And then there's a window up here. You would see feet going past, shoes going past. And he knew who the people were because he had worked on those shoes. There was hardly a pair of boots in the neighborhood that had not been once or twice through his hands. So he often saw his own handiwork through the window. Some he had resoled, some patched, some stitched up, and to some he had even put fresh uppers. He had plenty to do, for he worked well and used good material. I'm going to try to shorten this up a little bit. Martin had always been a good man, but in his old age he began to think more about his soul and to draw nearer to God. While he still worked for a master before he set up his own account, his wife had died, leaving him with a 3-year-old son. None of his elder children had lived. They all died in infancy. At first, Martin thought of sending his little son to his sisters in the country, but then he felt sorry to part with the boy, thinking, it would be hard for my little Capiton to grow up in a strange family. I will keep him with me. Martin left his master and went into lodgings with his little son, but he had no luck with his children. No sooner had the boy reached an age when he could help his father and be a support as well as a joy to him that he fell ill, and after being laid up for a week with a burning fever, died. Martin buried his son and gave way to despair so great and overwhelming that he murmured against God. In his sorrow he prayed again and again that he too might die, reproaching God for having taken the son he loved, his only son, while he, old as he was, remained alive. After that, Martin left off going to church. One day, an old man from Martin's native village, who had been a pilgrim for the last 8 years, called in on his way from Troysta to the monastery. Martin opened his heart to him and told him of his sorrow. I no longer even wish to live, holy man, he said. All I ask of God is that I may die. I am now quite without hope in the world. The old man replied, you have no right to say such things, Martin. We cannot judge God's ways. Not our reasoning, but God's will decides. If God willed that your son should die and you should live, it would be best so. As to your despair, that comes because you wish to live for your own happiness. What else should one live for? Asked Martin. For God, Martin, said the old man. He gives you life and you must live for him. When you have learned to live for him, you will grieve no more and all will seem easy to you. Martin was silent for a while and then asked, but how is one to live for God? That reminds me of the question the lawyer asked. The old man answered, how one may live for God has been shown us by Christ. Can you read? Then buy the Gospels and read them, and you will see how God would have you live. You have it all there. The word sank deep into Martin's heart, and the same day he went and bought himself a Testament in large print and began to read. At first, he meant only to read on holidays, but having once begun, he found it made his heart so light that he read every day. Sometimes he became so absorbed in his reading that the oil in his lamp burnt out before he could tear himself away from the book. He continued to read every night, and the more he read, the more clearly he understood what God required of him and how he might live for God. And his heart grew lighter and lighter. Before, when he went to bed, he used to lie with a heavy heart, moaning as he thought of his little Capiton. But now he only repeated again and again, glory to thee, O Lord, thy will be done. From that time, Martin's life changed. Formerly on holidays, he used to go and have tea at the public house and did not even refuse a glass or two of vodka. Sometimes after having had a drop with a friend, he left the public house not drunk, but rather merry, and would say foolish things, shout at a man, or abuse him. Now all that sort of passed away from him. His life became peaceful and joyful. He sat down to his work in the morning, and when he had finished his day's work, he took the lamp down from the wall and stood it on the table, fetched his book from the shelf, opened it, and sat down to read. The more he read, the better he understood, and the clearer and happier he felt in his mind. It happened once that Martin sat up late, absorbed in his book. He was reading Luke's Gospel. In the 6th chapter, he came upon the verses. To him that smiteth thee on one cheek, offer also the other. And from him that taketh away thy cloak, withhold not thy coat also. Give to every man that asketh thee, and from him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. And as ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. He also read the verses where our Lord says, and why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Whosoever cometh to me and heareth my sayings and doeth them, I will show you to whom he is like. He is like a man which built an house, and digged deep, and laid the foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose, the storm beat vehemently upon that house, and could not shake it, for it was founded upon a rock. But he that heareth and doeth not is like a man without a foundation, built an house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. When Martin read these words, his soul was glad within him. He took off his spectacles and laid them on the book, and leaning his elbows on the table, pondered over what he had read. He tried his own life by the standard of these words, asking himself, is my house built on the rock or on sand? If it stands on the rock, it is well. It seems easy enough while one sits here alone and one thinks one has done all that God commands. But as soon as I cease to be on my guard, I sin again. Still, I will persevere. It brings such joy. Help me, O Lord. He thought all this and was about to go to bed, but was loath to leave his book. So he went on reading the 7th chapter about the centurion, the widow's son, and the answer to John's disciples. And he came to the part where a rich Pharisee invited the Lord to his house. And he read how the woman who was a sinner anointed his feet and washed them with her tears, and how he justified her. Coming to the 44th verse, he read, and turning to the woman, he said unto Simon, Seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house, thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath wetted my feet with her tears, and wiped them with her hair. Thou gavest me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but she hath anointed my feet with ointment. He read these verses and thought, he gave no water for his feet, gave no kiss, his head with oil he did not anoint. And Martin took off his spectacles once more, laid them on his book, and pondered. He must have been like me, that Pharisee, who too thought only of himself, how to get a cup of tea, how to keep warm and comfortable, never a thought of his guest. He took care of himself, but his guest he cared nothing at all. Yet who was the guest? The Lord himself. If he came to me, should I behave like that? Then Martin laid his head upon both his arms, and before he was aware of it, he fell asleep. Martin! He suddenly heard a voice as if someone had breathed the word above his ear. He started from his sleep. Who's there? He asked. He turned around and looked at the door. No one was there. He called again. Then he heard quite distinctly, Martin, Martin, look out onto the streets tomorrow, for I shall come. Martin roused himself, rose from his chair and rubbed his eyes, but did not know whether he had heard these words in a dream or awake. He put out the lamp and lay down to sleep. Next morning, he rose before daylight, and after saying his prayers, he lit the fire and prepared the cabbage soup and buckwheat porridge. Then he lit the samovar, put on his apron, and sat down by the window to do his work. As he sat working, Martin thought over what had happened the night before, and sometimes it seemed to him like a dream, and at times he thought that he had really heard the voice. Such things have happened before now, thought he. So he sat by the window looking out into the street more than he worked, and whenever